Welcome to our second lecture for the lecture series this fall. I'm just here to make a couple of announcements. First of all, don't forget that right after the lecture, we have the opening for the first exhibition in the year's exhibition series over in Annex A. And if you don't know how to get there, the group will be walking that way. So the exhibition deals with study abroad works from Costa Rica, Japan, Spain, and the Pella Awards. And if you haven't been over to the exhibition space, so nicely designed by Nick Grusha and Matt Hume, please come over and take a look. The next announcement is for the next lecture in our series, which is the Metropolitan Miniature as a Medium of Modernism by Andreas Hussein, who's the Villard Professor of German and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. And this is a lecture sponsored by the Urban Image Workshop, which Miriam Pelflat is the head coordinator of, and they are sponsored in turn by the Humanities Institute here at UB. So please put that on your calendars. It's October 10th. And now I would like to introduce our GSA committee, or at least the two people that are going to be introducing our speakers, Kristen Gabriel and Chris Orbois.
Hello everybody, thank you for coming out tonight. I hope you're all as excited as we are for this presentation. Mark and Peter Anderson have practiced architecture on many corners of the globe in one fashion or another. Starting as a design-build construction company in 1984, the pair has since shown their skills for design in sustainability, modular construction, parametric design, emergency flood control, innovative material use, and general inventive wackiness.
Mark began his career in the construction industry as a carpenter during high school in Tacoma, Washington, and has worked on buildings not only in Washington but also in Massachusetts, Germany, Italy, and Japan. He gained an education in Asian studies in his home state and now holds a master's degree in architecture from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. In his professional career, a significant focus of Mark's work has been on new construction technology, and he has consulted corporations and government agencies in the U.S. and Asia, with his work appearing in books, journals, and television programs in the U.S., Asia, and in Europe. Mark is not a stranger to lecturing either, spending much of his time at universities as a guest collaborator and as faculty, including the University of Michigan, University of Washington, Cornell University, and University of Hawaii, and most recently at UC Berkeley.
Peter Anderson holds a master's degree in architecture from the GSD at Harvard University as well. Prior to obtaining his MArch, Peter received degrees relating to international study, including the University of Washington's Intensive Chinese Language Program and Pacific Lutheran University's French Language and Literature and Foreign Studies program. For several years, Peter was a visiting faculty member at the University of Hawaii School of Architecture and Planning, where he taught and researched topics of international business and their connections to opportunities in technology and urban development. Currently, Peter is an associate professor at the California College of the Arts, and in addition to this professional teaching experience, he is a seasoned speaker and critic among universities and institutes throughout the United States and abroad. Throughout his professional career, Peter's work has revolved around construction and communication technologies with a particular interest in their relation to international trade. His projects have received various regional, national, and international awards and have also been published in several books, journals, and magazines throughout the United States, Europe, Asia, and Australia.
Noted for their highly customized designs and innovative construction techniques, Anderson Architects has built extensively throughout the Pacific Northwest, as well as other areas across the United States and Japan, covering the design and construction of residential, commercial, and public art projects. Recently, the firm has been awarded numerous AIA medals and awards, a Wholesome Acknowledgement Prize and their work has been featured in Dwell, Architectural Record, and as part of a permanent collection at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. The Graduate Student Association would like to thank the Department of Architecture for their coordination and support in putting on this event. And now please join us in welcoming Mark and Peter Anderson.
I'm Peter. He's Mark. First of all, we want to thank you all for inviting us here. It's a really great opportunity. We've had a really fun day so far getting to know your school a little bit. We, in particular, want to thank the Graduate Student Association, all of the students for inviting us, and all of the officers, Kristen and Lance and Chris and Ned, right, who spent a lot of time with us today and gave us a great tour of the city. So we're very pleased to be here and to have a chance to see your school. Now what?
Well, also thank you to the school and to the department. Thank you to Dean Shibley and Chair Khan. We appreciate the chance to be here. So there was a little bit of concern we understood early on about how do you handle multiple or speakers when there are two of them. That can be a really annoying thing, and we understand that there's going to be a series of double speakers coming up, and so Jordan and Laura and Kristen were all involved in some discussion about maybe making use of the fact that there are doubles doing the lectures and making that more of a feature instead of an annoyance. So that's what sort of generated this title of Peat and Repeat. So Peat and Repeat, of course, is an old child's joke. I don't know how many of you have heard it, but old people like us have heard it. Probably Peter in particular, because his name is Pete. It gets repeated. But so why don't you tell the joke?
Pete and Repeat went out in a boat. One of them fell out, and who was left?
Repeat.
Pete and Pete, Repeat were out. Oh, you get it. All the Americans would know that. It's only the foreigners.
So that came up because our title also, the subtitle is the most important part, which is Practice of Serial Reformatting versus Core Competency. And
I don't understand it at all. Mark came up with that, and I asked him what it means, and he said he would explain it tonight. So we'll all learn what it means together.
Well, it was a forced, quick thing that had to come out because the poster had to be done, so we had to come up with something instantly. And actually, the Peat and Repeat part comes out of a series of titles which are always kind of disrespectful to whatever the topic is. And all of this is a little bit disrespectful to the series focus from what we understood it was going to be. A couple of years ago, we were at City College in New York, and they had a series on practice from different points of view. And the title that we came up with quickly for that was, the topic is practice. The title of our talk was How Do You Get to Carnegie Hall, which practice. But in this case, so there's the kind of joke aspect and this question of the way that one can work as an architect. And in the way that we've worked, we've always been reformatting what we do. We change all the time. And this is a little bit in contradiction to a very common sort of suggestion to architecture firms and business people in general, that instead of always reinventing yourself or always doing multiple different things, that you should identify your core competencies and stick to those core competencies. So that's a little bit of business jargon, core competency, which we dislike, that sort of jargon. It's also an aspect of an issue that's of some significance both in Buffalo and in our hometown of Tacoma, Washington, which is up here. But there's this kind of, in the last 30 years, this idea in corporate culture that people like Bain Capital can go out and take an interesting company, reduce it down to its core competency, sell off all of its interesting assets, make money off of selling interesting assets, then drive this kind of dull core competency leftover down into nothingness. And what you have is either a kind of empty shell of former potential or nothing at all. So there is, of course, a kind of logic to sticking to what you know how to do and doing that. But that's not interesting to most of us as architects. We're architects in general, for better and for ill. We tend to be generalists. We're interested in many different things. We do many different things. And so it's kind of a poor recommendation to architects anyway to stick to one thing instead of doing lots of things.
And just to put that in the context of an education, graduate school education, we understand the way your school is set up. Many of you here are coming in as graduate students, maybe with undergraduate degrees in other fields, which Mark and I did as well, as was pointed out in the introduction. And we kind of think of architects as they need to be generalists. Our specialization is being generalists. It's kind of the joke there. But there aren't very many fields where people are allowed to be generalists and have a broad range of interests and kind of coordinating competencies. And we feel quite strongly that that is a role that architects can and should play. And so we hope that'll come out a little bit as we present some of our work.
So last night we were fortunate to have dinner with Terry Kahn and Miriam and Laura and Jordan, and we were kind of joking that we come from a town where we grew up, Tacoma, Washington. We said that town is the Buffalo of the West Coast, and by that we meant it's a kind of it has a certain past glory. It has an enormous current potential. It's a kind of industrial port city that has had its ups and downs, and it has this kind of amazing remainder of some beautiful architecture and kind of amazing site. So you can see some of the relationship here. Tacoma is it's on Puget Sound. Mount Rainier is in the background. It's always this kind of magical presence in the city. So it's an incredible natural environment, but it's also been an incredible industrial environment for the last 100 years. And so this is an image of what's called the Tide Flats. It's the industrial area that's somewhat equivalent to some of the things we were looking at with Kristen and her team this afternoon in the industrial parts of Buffalo. And this is very important to us from childhood on, but as after we went to graduate school, we went back to Tacoma and started our construction company. So much of our work initially was in this Delta industrial mudflat area, which has all these incredible former shipbuilding plants. They're amazing fabrication shops, welders, absolutely, and timber industries. Everything that any builder or architect could ever want to work with was in this place. And so we've always thought of this as kind of amazing delta where the interesting thing about deltas is everything comes together. There's this kind of intermixing of everything. And in industrial modern cities, it's not only the confluence of all the tributaries of water, but it's all these kinds of industrial things that come together. So these are places of a certain amount of toxicity and poison and a certain amount of beauty and promise. So that's a kind of foundation that's present in all of our work, this kind of fascination with the industrial capacity of the industry, the industrial capacity of modern cities and the opportunities that architects have to build things, and this relationship to the landscape itself. So we do in our work a lot of building, but also a lot of investigative work in things like landscape drawing. So this is a landscape. It's a series of lithographic prints and drawings dealing with a number of issues. This is a drawing from the mid-90s that just had to do with the site of this kind of atmospheric, in fact, this evanescence. This is left over on the board. I don't know what class it came from, but it's exactly the sorts of issues that we were interested in: evanescence and luminescence and atmospheric silence. This is the kind of landscape of media that we were drawing in this case. So there's the kind of physical, topographic, geographic landscape that we like to draw and build objects within that are kind of instruments of measure of the natural environment, and mapping the kind of lesser or less specific, more ambient sort of information that's a part of our modern experience. So we build a lot of smaller structures that do tend to be landscape specific and industrial methodology specific projects. We draw these things in a great deal of detail. This is a project, a small project for a university environmental science department. Is a kind of pavilion down in Texas. And we always do all of our own steel detailing, all of our own fabrication drawings. A lot of them go straight to digital work, partly because, digital fabrication from our own drawings, partly because we want to be very engaged in the construction process, in the industry of construction, and partly because that's a way to get things done the way we want to do them. So in addition to these kinds of pure, more extreme construction-related things, which are still intended to be instruments of experience of the environments that we live in, we've also done a lot of installations, public art installations, and other projects. So in this case, this is a project that we did in Alaska a long time ago. That was actually an urban design proposition and an urban analysis, but instead of drawing this urban analysis of the city of Anchorage in Alaska, we were trying to reduce experiential issues in the city down to very fundamental sorts of qualities. So in this case, we had an experience in that city of light that's almost always at the horizon. It's extremely intense. It's either reflected off water in the summer or reflected off snow in the winter, so you're almost always blinded. And that was a quality that we thought was especially interesting there, because we were interested in thinking about what sorts of experiences we have of the city and of the landscape that are not visual primarily, but are experienced in other ways by our bodies. And so this blinding, using light to blind rather than to show, was very much part of the experience of the city. And so in this installation, we first made a blinding light that took away any sort of visual apprehension of what was happening. And then we had a construction that created the other sorts of experiences that are key to Anchorage, which is extreme heat and extreme cold. Heat is usually inside, cold is usually outside, but there are times in the summer when these things are somewhat reversed. So we had these big bladders and radiators, and they were all identical.
Visually and form-wise identical.
Yeah.
But in the experiential aspect, some of them were heated with hot water running through them, hydronic heating systems, and some were cooled with cold, chilled water running through them. So the concept of the space was that your eyes would tell you that the space was symmetrical. As you walked through it, you would have to listen to your body. Your body would eventually tell you that the wall on this side is hot, the wall on this side is cold, and then it reversed as we went down the space. So in that project, we got very involved in plumbing, and just this idea of making an environment that it's a very experiential environment, but it's kind of working against the concept that we can tell with our eyes everything that we need to know about a space.
So in addition to those big rubber bladders that have circulating water in them, there are also these steel radiator plates along the side, and then on the floor, and we invited people to take their shoes off. On the floor, we had brought up from the mud flats, which are always interesting and important to us as tidal mud flats. We took some of the saltwater mud from the harbor, and we made a hydronically heated floor system out of this kind of saltwater mud, which gave a kind of clammy cold experience on the chilled part and a heated kind of steamy component, and it created a very distinct set of smells in the space. So you have this kind of blinded, absolute physical sameness, or visual sameness with extremely different qualities of experience within it. So that, of course, to make something kind of pure and simple like that requires a lot of, as Peter said, plumbing, a lot of layers of construction. And then we became interested in how do you document something that is supposed to be invisible in a certain way. So we started to get involved with infrared video. So that was something that became very interesting to us in this space, that we could take the non-visual wavelength of light and start to understand how it interacted with our experience of space. So in this case, the actual center of heat is the person in the middle, I think that's Peter, and then his repeat on the side is actually essentially equivalent, but he's transmitting his spatial presence through space, and it's embedded in one of the radiators on the side.
So essentially, it's a reflection. I mean, that's something you probably all learn in your energy study courses, but when you're standing next to a wall, your body is making it's affecting the wall. So you're making a kind of a shadow on the wall of body heat, but this was a really interesting way that was accidental to us that we discovered this through this documentation of the space, that there's a heat reflection as well as a visual reflection. You didn't see this visually.
And so just spatially, instead of thinking, as we usually do in modern architecture in particularly, that we are placing objects or having ourselves in empty space, we started to become very interested in this kind of dense liquid space where we're all kind of interpenetrating each other in different envelopes of heat and humidity, and this is all actually not people and chairs and objects in an empty space. It's a very, very full space. So that became an interesting, a major interest to us in a lot of our later work of how to deal with this density of space as opposed to point, line, plane within a kind of continuum of empty space. So that's kind of a theoretical, experimental side of what we do, but we're also very, and we don't think of these things as separate, but we also are asked, fortunately, we have good opportunities to build things. There are people who are not as interested in these envelopes of heat and humidity and bright color and stuff. They want to build. So that's another aspect of what we do, and that's still very much a part of our the same sort of series of thoughts about experience and space, but in a somewhat different format.
So we're going to show you a few projects out of our combined building and designing. So we've always been involved. Mark and I started working as carpenters on mostly on our own projects, sometimes on other people's projects, and then transitioning more and more to having people working with us. Eventually we started hiring carpenters that were a lot better than us, and we started learning from them and doing bigger projects. but it was kind of important. Our earliest work was very, very site-specific and very craft-oriented. We grew up in the Northwest, and wood construction was extremely important. Designing buildings that highlighted the use of wood, the direct connection to the landscape, and kind of reacting, kind of carving a building into this landscape, of heavily treed landscape of the Pacific Northwest, was almost like excavating work out of an already full environment of a landscape. So as we started working, we got very excited from very early on with access to any kind of digital modeling of the landscape and of buildings within the landscape. And we're not ourselves the computer whizzes that everybody younger than us is, but we have from the very beginning been very excited about what the new ways of drawing and modeling space have to do with the making of architecture. So it comes back to both the digital realm of making spaces and connections of spaces into the landscape, and the very physical realm. So on a daily basis, spending time in the steel fabrication shop with people that we might work in with one shop that has absolutely no digital connection or interest or capabilities, and then another opportunity maybe to work with someone who's completely digitally focused. And increasingly that has opened more and more opportunities for us. But the kind of primary place that we come from is the kind of handcrafted work of making individually designed for their site buildings. That was our earliest work, a lot of it houses, a lot of it making parts, designing them individually. But then as we started getting more involved in other opportunities beyond the kind of individual one-by-one craft-focused house, we started getting very interested in prefabrication, different systems of prefabrication. This was actually our first kind of main project of analyzing a building, which was partly done. We designed the building to require us to build it off-site because we really wanted to do a test case of something that would be built somewhere other than the site. So we made a building, it's a balloon-framed building where the walls are much higher than the width of the building, so we couldn't follow the usual practice of platform framing where you would lay out a wall on a flat surface and tilt it up and then build the second floor on top of that and tilt it up. So we kind of started from the beginning saying we're going to do something that really couldn't be using this system easily built on site, and built this project about 20 years ago. The funny thing is, Dwell magazine started getting interested in their first issues in prefabricated building systems. So this was about 2000 or so, and they came to us because we'd been working with things, and they said we want to feature something, and they fell in love with this house, and they put it on the cover of their first issue about prefab, kind of introducing their whole interest in prefab. At that point, this building was 10 years old, and they made us promise not to tell anybody it was 10 years old because they were trying to kind of promote this idea that there was a new interest in prefabricated building systems, and so we had actually started doing things with that quite a lot earlier. And from our earliest work with that, it was kind of a dirty word. You never told anybody that any part of the building was prefabricated or off-site fabricated. And that would mean you couldn't get bank financing. Everybody would think it was a cheap modular home building or something. And it's been very interesting to us in more recent years. There's actually an embrace of that from a design point of view, from a design interest point of view. So this brings us much more current from that early, very analog, hand-built, prefabricated off-site to a lot of our current work, which is still looking at this issue of site-specific off-site fabrication as opposed to mass fabrication. So this is a house that we designed and was just finished in Kumamoto, Japan, just a couple of years ago. Very simple, modern house in a lot of ways, connecting with traditions of modernism and but also traditions of Japanese construction systems. It's all exposed timber that is a Japanese system of exposed timber construction, but it was all digitally fabricated elements to the building and in combination with wood. So kind of coming, this was a prefabricated building in a certain sense that all the parts were pre-cut off-site, and that is the traditional Japanese timber framing approach to a building, making all the parts in a factory, numbering them, bringing them then to the site and reassembling the primary frame, but kind of connecting that with the more modern system of digital fabrication. To show you just a couple of other projects, working with a very specific landscape has been very important to us from early on, and connecting that again with an off-site fabrication technique is kind of our fascination. And to us, the site specificity is not changed at all by choosing other building systems. In this case, it was a very beautiful mountain site with a very difficult place to attach foundations. And when we met with the engineers there, they said, "Oh, you could attach to the rock. This whole place is rock. It's going to be very expensive to drill into the rock to make foundations." And we said, "Well, what can the rock hold?" We said, "The rock is extremely strong." So we said, "Well, let's make the foundation then as small as possible and use the rock as the foundation, and then have a very tiny foundation, and then the building cantilevers out above that." And so you can see the cantilevers, I think it's 36 feet out, kind of over a cliff. And so we worked on a system of steel moment frame combined with a sandwich panel system. So here you see the kind of primary structural systems. And our interest in this was a very difficult site to get to. So here you see the cantilevered aspect. And having a chance to kind of take advantage of the fact that it was a difficult site to access, and using foam-based sandwich panels in a way that the sandwich panel manufacturer kept telling us, we don't want you to do this, we don't want you to do this because our panels aren't meant to be cantilevered. And we kept saying, panels aren't cantilevering, the steel structural frame is cantilevering. And it was a very interesting process to kind of work through this and kind of push forward with experimenting and trying different ways of connecting these systems.
So this is another example of a semi-prefabricated building. This one's in Abiquiu, New Mexico. It's on a river basin right below a cliff where Georgia O'Keeffe's Adobe House is. And there are actually a number of beautiful Adobe buildings right in this area. But we didn't, and this is kind of a series of buildings that we've done that are in quite special locations, but where we haven't felt that it's either appropriate or quite the right thing to fit in a kind of conventional notion of what is the site-specific, site-appropriate building, but instead we wanted to build something that is an armature for a very simple background armature for experiencing the site. So it's something that's all about the site, but it doesn't look like the site. It organizes itself to take advantage of a particular experience. So in this case, it's a very interesting program. It's a couple that one is an archaeologist and the other is a concert pianist of modern music. So she does performances at her house. They also are collectors of stray animals, and so they have dogs, cats, chickens, goats. They wanted all of these different things, but it's in the desert where there are also all kinds of predators, eagles, coyotes, rattlesnakes, and things. So essentially, we have to make this kind of protective cage, both for the people and the different animals had to be separated from each other and separated from the natural environment. So the building, and we've done a number of buildings that have gotten ruined because people put these dog runs around them with chain link and things. So we said this time we're going to make the whole thing out of mesh and just fold it all into one simple structure as a series of cages. So because it's in this particular climate, there were a lot of studies of natural ventilation, cooling, and daylighting, and solar shading. And you can see the piano, this piano shape. That piano had to be in a spot that would never have sunlight hitting it directly. So that was one of the aspects of the analytical design process. So it's a series of, and actually this dimension is another thing, veils of glass and veils of chainmail in this case, that are detailed in it's kind of simple industrial processes, simple industrial materials. It goes together. A lot of it's prefabricated off-site, and it creates these kind of layers of translucency that allows you to experience the nature and the light in a variety of different ways, but it does separate the different program elements. And we think it still fits in very nicely to this river, kind of river flat in the desert arrangement. So one of the things that you'll just kind of see in the background of what we're doing there are some of the sketches and drawings that we do along the way towards some of these projects. And they're never so specific. I mean, eventually they become kind of specific to the project. A lot of times they're very kind of loosely investigated, but those sketches and drawings start to show up in the projects. So this is a building in Palo Alto that we just finished recently. We don't have totally finished images of it, but this is a very inexpensive modular house. So it's built in California, but it's finally constructed, sited in California, but it's built in Oregon in 5 modules, and shipped down, and all installed in one day. Of course, there's foundations and stuff before, and then there's knitting together afterwards. But in a single day, all these pieces were kind of flown over the lines with a crane and stacked up. So this is kind of the most compact, tight, inexpensive house that would be possible to do in that place. It's very efficiently built in a place with lower labor costs, but good quality. And this is always a kind of quandary about prefabrication. Some people think it's about making things cheaper. It's about putting carpenters out of work, and that's not at all the way we think about it. We think about it as a way to create stable, higher-paid factory jobs where you have a higher quality of work instead of being a kind of boom and bust economy for carpenters. It's a kind of steady flow of work in a stable place. So there's a lot of kind of benefit, both in terms of labor, in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of material efficiency, in putting these things together in factories. So then it arrives in these modules. This is a difficult site. It has to go over wires and trees, and it gets stacked up in place. And then there's just a few areas that have to be knitted together on the interior to finish it out. So
this was literally from 8 o'clock in the morning one day until like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We went from a bare foundation to what appeared to be a completely finished building. And that was kind of one of our experiments of how far can you go in the factory, including the cabinetry, the tile works, hydronic flooring system, really fairly complex systems, the wood flooring, everything, and then designing what becomes very interesting to us then is how do you design the connections from these 5 big chunks that are going to come in from on trucks. It's really the site aspect of it becomes doubly important because you don't want it to look like it was zipped together out of parts. So that leads to a lot of imagining how those final joints and connections can be applied.
So this, we'll just show you a few examples of these kinds of projects, which are prototypes for more serial production of buildings. This is a project on Lake Michigan. It's in a very nice cherry orchard. Looks out over the lake, and it's on a very compact leftover piece of corner property within these cherry orchards. So the actual footprint available to it was very minimal. These are kind of typical of our design process, where we do some kind of loose experimental models early on. We do a lot of redlining of the different pieces and different iterations and testing of things. And in this case, again, it's intended to be a simple sort of industrial type of armature for getting people up into the landscape and experiencing it. It's intended to be somewhat scaleless because this is in an agricultural area where there aren't kind of housey type houses around. There are a lot of more agricultural, large-scale buildings. So we wanted it to not have the scale, a kind of residential scale of little windows and things. We wanted it to be more like the other buildings, so that you don't kind of gentrify the landscape any more than necessary. And so it uses most of the materials of the other buildings, the agricultural buildings. It's a corrugated, galvanized corrugated steel siding. But in addition to that, it has 2 feet out from that corrugated siding, there's a corrugated translucent acrylic siding. So that our intention, and we call this the chameleon house, the intention of it is that in this kind of amazing transformation of the seasons in that site, where you go from the winter tracery of black sticks against white snow, to the early spring green, to the denser green, to the yellows and the reds. There's this continual cycle of amazing color variation. So our intent was between this kind of dully reflective galvanized corrugated skin and this translucent outer skin, we could capture that color and blend it with the sky, blend it with the pinks and the greens and the colors of the adjacent trees, and make it have a kind of a halo effect, a kind of indistinct presence in the landscape, rather than a kind of severe presence. It's a little controversial whether or not it was site sensitive or not, and we understand now it's well liked. At the time it was being constructed, there was a blog with very kind of nasty things going on about it, and there was some concern
from the neighbors.
There was some concern that the kind of reflective quality might blind drivers on the highway, and none of that came to pass, except the last time that we visited there a couple of years ago. We were standing on that deck in the front at night, and all of a sudden there was this car crash down below that we could only hear, we couldn't see it. And we started.
And there's about 2 cars per hour on the road in front of it.
So we felt a little responsible for that.
I think someone was looking up at the house. But the kind of idea of orchards, at about the same time we were working on this project in Northern California, where the clients came to us with a a site that was beautiful. It was 5 acres of planted trees, all apple trees, and they told us to go figure out where on this 5 acres we were going to design a house for them. And we went there and we kept walking around saying there's no place for a house, it's already full of trees. And we really felt that these trees were beautiful, gnarled old 100-year-old trees. And we thought we can't cut down these trees, that's just too much responsibility. The owners were off, they lived in New York, they wanted us to figure out what trees to cut or whatever. So we spent days there, we drew every tree, we numbered every tree. We thought if we're going to tear out a tree, this has got to, we have to really understand them. We photographed every tree, we gave every tree a name, a ranking for different things. We did some photographs, a lot of photographs, a lot of printmaking to study them, and eventually the pattern started to develop in our understanding. Not all trees were equal. There was a beautiful 25-foot square grid between all the trees. Some of them were new trees that had been replaced. Even though they were the healthier trees, in some ways they had less soil to them than some of the older trees. So we eventually started understanding the space within this grid of this orchard. And this relates to the kind of density of space that we've always been interested in. And started then imagining how do you weave, it's a fairly large program of 2 houses and some artist studios within this orchard. And the other part of giving the trees so much importance was we actually put them in our construction documents so that the people working on site, every drawing has the actual tree in its right place, so that like the people who are working on the bulldozers trying to dig the space, they understand it's not just a lollipop tree that we took out of SketchUp or something that's on our drawings. We had photographs of the trees as part of the construction drawings to try to make everyone feel the same importance about the trees. The other part of that was keeping the house below the trees, so it's a very low building. And the other part of the orchard that we were so fascinated by is this grid, the 25-foot square grid, and then the allays of space between these grids. And we felt we couldn't put any solid elements to block those. So we started working with this system of U-shaped concrete columns, which become all the structure, the moment frame structure, so that then between these columns go on the tree grid. So they all locate wherever a tree would go. There were very few we had to cut, but they replace the trees so that then the space between them are all openings of glass. So for instance, in some of these long views, you could look down a couple hundred feet through the house, and we always line up windows and doorways so that you can see in one side of the house, out the other, down these allays of glass. We're out from the kitchen table, or the kitchen, looking down the areas of trees. And then the important thing to us is this is something you could do maybe more in a California environment than here, but having the inside and the outside flow together, partly because one of the son in the family was in a wheelchair, and so that we wanted to make every part of the building accessible. So there actually aren't any windows. All of the openings are doors that go floor to ceiling. The ceiling extends right out, and the floor extends right out, so that because the climate is quite mild, it can go in and out at all the times of the year, just kind of flowing in and out.
So now we're going to show a kind of different series, not the houses and the site-specific, but still prototype for sort of mass customization sorts of projects. But here, the other type of work that we do is a lot of research into modular type building systems that can be repetitive. And this is a good time maybe to talk just very quickly about what is happening on the sides.
Is there something happening on the side?
Yeah. So those aren't just a totally willful distraction. They relate in quite a few different ways to some of the issues that we're talking about. But one of the most important is this sort of, well, on the one hand, this kind of continual gathering of extraneous materials and extraneous experiences that are not specifically clarified in terms of their intents about how they are going to weave into the core competency. But it's a kind of absolute faith that experience itself and a kind of breadth of looking, watching, kind of intense interest in everything always does flow back into the project, into the core body of work. And so this again is one of the strengths of architecture, of architects, is to be interested and to believe as a kind of faith that we can draw upon our experience and that it has intrinsic value. So that's one aspect of these just kind of extraneous film clips that are going on. The other thing, again related to seriality and repetition, but difference within repetition, and the ability, like the recognition in this kind of constructed landscape of the orchard, where it at first glance seems to all be absolutely the same, but actually has a kind of intense difference within this grid, particularity, personality of individual components of the grid. So related to that is this kind of serial interest in repetition that has personality and has difference within it. And so Andy Warhol, of course, is one of the great pioneers of kind of interest in the mundane, the serial, the repetitive, but recognizing that there's actually an intense sort of variability and personality and insight within that sort of variability. So just a couple of days ago, we were in Pittsburgh, involved in a potential project with the Andy Warhol Museum, and they have in their gallery the opportunity to sit down and do one of his screen tests, which Andy Warhol is famous for his screen tests in the 60s, where he'd have somebody sit in front of a camera for 3 minutes and then and try not to move and just to try to make the most banal image of a person. But then by
repeating in the Andy Warhol Museum 2 days ago, trying to be as banal as possible, sitting in a chair, getting my own screen test to see if I can get my 15 minutes of frame or paint.
So I mean, clearly nobody is going to be as good at being banal and ordinary looking than Peter and me, so we're already kind of well on our way there. But the interesting thing is, to us, is this kind of interest in looking into the most banal sort of approaches to things and finding inspiration, finding potential, finding difference within it. So Andy Warhol, of course, is a great hero to us in terms of his ability to kind of transform our understanding of the world that we live in. And
to take us back in some ways to this project here, one of the most ubiquitous buildings throughout the country that is not designed by architect is the modular classroom. And modular classrooms are all over the country, they're everywhere, they're horrible. Many of them are very poorly built, poorly insulated, poorly thought through, and yet, I forget some huge percentage, 35% of classes are taught in these temporary modular classrooms. So we had a really interesting opportunity a few years ago. The state of Hawaii is one of the biggest users of modular classrooms. They have more than 10,000, and you think of that as a small state, but more than 10,000 single classroom modular buildings scattered through the islands. And the Department of Education for the state of Hawaii realized that they're also very energy inefficient. They're in a very mild climate, and yet they're all closed up, and they use air conditioning to create a natural, a workable environment. So they did a kind of a competitive request for proposals to develop the prototype for the next generation of modular portable classrooms. And that was very exciting to us, and we teamed up with a manufacturer and with a modular building contractor to do one of the proposals. We were very pleased that ours was selected out of several, all kind of good, interesting collection of people. So this building, which is just being finished this month in Hawaii, we went through this very complicated vetting process because they weren't just looking for one building. They said over the next few years they're going to be replacing 10,000 of these, depending on budgets, of course, buildings. So they really wanted to take this seriously. So they had a whole team of people to analyze our proposals before it could get built. It had to be ready to go through all of these very complex analyses of modeling, energy modeling, daylighting modeling, and our job was to convince them that we could do a zero net energy building. That was their requirement, to be zero net energy. The first part of this was to make our building use as little energy as possible, which meant planning for natural ventilation and making it not necessary to have air conditioning in the building, which is one of the big users of energy. The second biggest is lighting. So with the clear-story windows, getting natural daylighting to work. So first of all, we got it down to where the building used very little energy, and then with solar panels on the roof all facing south, it is projected to actually produce much more energy than it will use, about 4 times as much energy as the building would use, even with all the plug loads. So this, making a very energy efficient building that then produces its own energy, it's part of a whole series of zero net energy projects that we've been working on for different climates and different locations that are all based on the idea of the modular building base. So we've done different kind of coats for these different buildings, and we've done different versions for different parts of the country, different latitudes, and all with this idea that the modular building industry is not very well thought of, and maybe for really good reasons. A lot of the buildings done by the modular building industry have been very low quality. It's not universally true, but there is a huge amount of price. We're trying to do the cheapest possible buildings for construction sheds and classrooms. And so we've been involved in a number of kind of interesting projects that allowed us to challenge that idea that modular buildings have to be low quality and low quality buildings, but also low quality reaction to the environment. So one of the most interesting, so we were awarded this project in Hawaii, and that got some publicity. There were all kinds of delays on that. So in the meantime, before that even got built, we got connected with Harvard University that needed a child care center. They were really interested. Our other design had won a number of awards as an unbuilt building. Harvard needed a 2.5-year building, kind of like your surge buildings out here. They were going to be renovating another building. They had to move child care center into a space. Probably more than just about any other kind of building, child care centers have to be healthy, happy. You've got most of the children were the children of faculty at Harvard. So you've got all these people who want this. It can't be just a temporary building. It has to be really a good building, even though it was only for a 2.5-year period. So we had a chance to work with a different set of manufacturers and contractors to build. We still had a very tight budget, but to build a building that would be, in this case, had to have very healthy indoor air requirement and a high quality environment for many ways, high energy savings. So this building then was built before Harvard. We worked with the modular industry. They're not, the thing we were really pleased about is the factories were usually not asked to do very high quality buildings. It's not that they couldn't. And in working with them, rather than doing kind of traditional working drawings, we did very detailed, we work all in Revit in our office. We model every piece down to the finest details. So we did a lot of these drawings to connect with the factory and to talk to them about sequence of assembly and exactly how to put it together. So it was, first of all, we learned a lot from the modular building industry. They were building in a very different way, but we were able to work with them in a very cooperative way to do FSC certified wood and very high insulating value products. They were excited to do that as well. So that kind of started a whole series of things, and this building won a number of design awards that people were saying we never thought that a modular building would be entered into, entered into design award programs because they generally are the kind of lowest common denominator out of things. But we really wanted to show you don't have to have a really high budget to be able, if you work with kind of within the existing industry, but also work with tweaking it a little bit to kind of set higher standards. Do you want to explain the apple? The apple is just a kind of minor piece, but because it's such a kind of ordinary building for the most part, we thought it should have one thing at least that signifies that it's a school building for kids. And so we did this in San Francisco and sent it out. This is basically a wrapper for one of the structural columns, so that instead of looking like the roof is held up by another steel column, it looks like it's held up by an apple. And so this is a CAD-CAM fabricated thing. It's made out of foam and fiberglass and epoxy paint. It's an apple like the apple that supposedly kids used to bring to the teacher. It also has a birdhouse in it. It has a kind of a wormhole in it. So it has a few little things in it to make it a kind of special part of the experience for the kids going in and out of school. So it took a lot of kind of fabrication drawing and planning. These are some of the interior mural types of things that came out of our sketchbooks and then translated into wall paint. And these are some of the views of it. So it's a very inexpensive thing. There are also, we had to use very standard windows, very standard ways of doing things, but we added a few things like these windows that are at a level where the kids could look out of the building. So now just really quickly, we're going to, and I know we're kind of over time, we've tried to layer on a few many things, but we wanted to quickly show a few things that we do with students. And this kind of background of being interested not only in the idea and the things we do with our minds, but really being insistent that the things that we do with our hands is an essential part of the process is important to us. And just as a quick entry into this, we had the experience of getting to see this beehive that your students built here, which is a pretty amazing object in itself. We took a few liberties with this photosynth view of it this afternoon, but this, and I hope you're not offended by this view. It's actually this kind of simple, pure form, but we were trying to show a couple of sides of it at once. And we were interested later in the afternoon when we were talking to Dean Shibley. He has a nice model of this on his desk. It's clearly an important part of the ethos of this school in so many ways, this kind of hands-on building. And that's an interest that we share in our own work and with our own students. So I'm just going to go very quickly through a few things that we've done. This is a project
trying to use only non-recyclable plastics, building so the things that can't be recycled, figuring out ways to reuse them. So different kinds of construction products, interlocking wall panels and systems. This was a building that we did with a small building at UC Berkeley. The students at that time, because of parametric program interests and things, they wanted to make a building, or they were always talking about making buildings that could shrink and grow depending on how many people were in it. And so Peter and I thought, well, if you're going to talk about those things, you better figure out how to make them. So the students had to design a building that would actually get bigger when more people were in it, and would get smaller when fewer people would get in it. So it's a kind of complex challenge. It's a building that can go down to 2 feet in diameter, it can go up to 16 feet in diameter, and it has this kind of complicated scissor mechanism with a bridge, so that when people go up that bridge, the more weight that's on the bridge, the more it forces the system down, and that swells these ribs and expands the building. So it can either be small for a small group of people, or it can get, as more people come into it, it expands. So that's, just go through. This is something that might be too lame, but it's not so important.
It was important.
It was important.
It made the faculty really mad at us because we hung things over their windows for a few months. So we've learned not to do that.
Well, not something as scum water, and but that's it was something that was supposed to absorb CO2 in the air. These are a few projects we've done with the students. This was at Mount Whitney. It was a project for the National Forest Service, trailhead structure. Students built at the school and then brought up there. This was a project that was designed at about the time of the Sri Lanka tsunami, or the Indian Ocean tsunami, and the earthquake at Kashmir all happened about the same time. Students were interested in making some disaster relief structures. So this is another kind of expanding building that quite different. It was built in a scale that could be, that would just fit into a typical military helicopter that would be used for disaster relief, and then it kind of springs out like a slinky. And part of the program of it was to have a building that would not only be a kind of immediate shelter, but it would store water, it would capture water, it would filter water, it would have warmth storage and ventilation and things, so that it could continue over the longer period. This is a kind of interesting little project that we did with the students at Berkeley in the courtyard. In San Francisco, almost all year long, or in Berkeley, we have sun potential during the day, and then in the evening it gets cold. So the idea was to make it possible to show outdoor movies and to create this kind of small amphitheater that would hold about 30 people, that would gather during the sunny part of the day. It would lie it would lie open. It would heat up, and there was this kind of recirculating using a solar powered pump, a recirculating hot water system. So with this system of jackets of circulating hot water and water ballast, this object would heat up during the day, then it could close as an orb, essentially an orange, and with these little segments of orange, and then it would close until it was in conserve its heat until it was time for it to get loaded up for outdoor performance. And it then it would open up and it would be heated, and in addition have electric lighting in it. And so on the one hand, this was a piece of furniture or kind of piece of outdoor production, but the thing that interested us about it was that we could, instead of doing a design-build project that was about kind of normative ways of making construction, which tends to encourage students to just look at typical details and things. Our interest was to say, now we're going to make a building that it has plumbing, it has electricity, it has structure, it has enclosure, it has skin. So we could divide the team up into all of these subcontractor specialties, but it isn't going to be the standard form. So the students learned a lot about plumbing, they learned about electricity, they learned a lot about all of the components of a building, but they had to learn about these things from scratch in a totally investigative way. So they each went out in each of these teams. There were about 38 students involved. Some worked with plumbers, some worked with electricians, they worked with fabricators, and they really had to put these systems together. So that's a kind of project. Oh, and this is just a quick one. And then, of course, we had no money after that. Because when we were first hired, I'm sure you know how that works too, you're promised money for design-build projects. Then, after you've been there a couple of years, there's no money anymore. So in this one, we said, okay, we're going to make the biggest possible thing we can do with absolutely no money. So it's a water filtration system we thought this would be a great way to filter water in kind of third world areas, places where water is a real problem, access to water, and we would make it out of the most ubiquitous material that you could find anywhere in the world. So that we would design this thing as a prototype, put it on the web, and anybody could build it anywhere. So it's a structure of, it's all made out of plastic water bottles. So it takes this kind of extremely wasteful water transportation method of the water bottle and turns it into a water catchment and filtration system. So the structure is also the plumbing tubes that are packed with filtration material, and water can either fall into it or it can be thrown up from rivers into the top, and it filters over time and creates a kind of celebratory source of water in a place. We call it the enormous plastic rainflower. So I think we will just quickly jump to a final project. Or what do you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So while we do that, you might have noticed that Jordan has been visiting us in both live and recorded forms. He was disappointed to not be able to be here because he's away at a conference, and I've known Jordan, we both have for quite a while. We taught together I taught with him at California College of the Arts, so he's popping in from time to time up there. So we're going to introduce this. This is our final project, the Lips Tower, which was mentioned in the introduction, and
it would make a little more sense if we saw some of the earlier pieces, but one of the things that we have worked on quite a bit is super absorbent polymer that is able to expand to 2,000 times its weight and volume when it gets wet. So it's a material that's usually used in oil spill cleanup and most commonly in baby diaper, disposable baby diapers. It's this very powerful but inexpensive material, and we first proposed it for a project in New Orleans as a contemporary levee system, but then that transformed into a number of other proposed uses. So in this proposal, it's a water tower, basically, for San Francisco, and it has, it's all powered by the superabsorbent polymer. So it's an active building facade, it's an active building system, but it doesn't move based on motors or normal hydraulics. It moves on this kind of superabsorbent expansion and contraction based on water absorption in the material. So the idea of this thing is to have a water tower that is a water catchment system and a water and an energy catchment system. So it's intended to be a local source for energy and water production rather than bringing water in. So in San Francisco, we have a very interesting history of water. First of all, very controversially, in the 1890s, a dam was made up in the Sierras. The Hetch Hetchy Reservoir was created. It flooded one of the most beautiful valleys in Yosemite National Park, and that is the source of drinking water to this day in San Francisco. And it's been a huge concern ever since about the destructive history of this system. And what happened at that time, which was very interesting, there's such a celebration of water being brought into the city that there were these, throughout the city, there were these, they were called water cathedrals. So, but these little celebratory structures, which were the water pumping stations. So there's this history of a kind of celebration of the point where the water comes. So first of all, we thought instead of this kind of destructive bringing water from afar and bringing energy from afar, we'd build a system that collects the water and filters the water locally and that collects the energy locally. And because there's no money for infrastructure, this would have to be a skin on a office tower. So it's using this kind of active facade. It's a system that is basically lips and tongues and throats that swallow the water. So when it's raining, the tongue sticks out and captures the water. When there's fog, it sticks out and condenses the water on it. When it's not needed, it contracts and allows sunlight to enter, because most often we want sunlight in San Francisco to warm the building. But when shade is needed, it sticks back out to shade the building, so it's a self-shading mechanism, and it has photovoltaic fabric on the top of the system. So it's all using the same kind of fabric and superabsorbent technology, so creating valves that rely on letting water in or out of the system to power the mechanism. And the lips open when ventilation is needed, they close when ventilation is not needed, and then there's this kind of active shading, energy capture, water capture system on the facade. So it's developed in a lot of detail, which is also, it's a big part of our interest is to take something that is maybe questionable on its surface, but going into it.
Questionable taste?
Well, possibly questionable taste, questionable in all kinds of ways, but really then exploring it to the nth degree, making model after model iteration of drawings, and continuing to develop every detail, and to take something that could be just a one-off, casual idea, but to say, no, this is possible, and it could be quite an amazing structure, a structure that is inherently provocative. It's a kind of celebration of water, a celebration of energy, a celebration of place. It's always different every time of the day. It's a celebration of the weather, and it is this kind of totally unexpected but supremely practical, we think, presence in the city. So it has a certain level of absurdity, a certain level of humor, but also a kind of practicality. And ultimately, that's what we think. Everything that we make is at its most ambitious. It should be full of life, it should be full of energy, it should be full of an insistence on multiple levels of productivity and functionality, one of which is the pursuit of happiness and life and kind of urban vitality. So that's this kind of swallowing of the presence around us of the kind of natural environment, taking it into a kind of reflowering of potential in the city is what we're interested in. So
that concludes our run through things, and we'll be happy to talk and questions or anything else. I know we spoke a little longer than we intended to, so
there's still light outside. Okay.
Was everything clear?
Anybody have questions? Yeah, it's really great stuff. And the question wants to know more. How are you got something that's prosaic, how are the fees that stuff is a lot of research? Not just in this one, which is other stuff. In some of the earlier things, there's a tremendous interest in craft and going to go and all the man and dragonfly and wondering every aspect of it. And it seems like it translates into not only our genius, which we have, but design too.
Yeah, I mean, that's always a struggle for every architect. Is what. No, neither before we started and even less so.
Certainly not now.
So, yeah, and that's part of our interest in prototypes for mass production. There is this architecture is very problematic for its inability to find a way to make sense of itself economically, and that gets worse and worse all the time. So our, on the one hand, we have a kind of more artistic interest, and at the same time we have an ambition to say we really need, as a profession, we have to figure out a way to make sense of our presence in the economy. So we have worked on a lot of these kind of modular projects. We do a lot of design build projects, and for us, we've never made a lot of money at it, but there's always projects going on that we're working on incidentally, where we think, oh, this one could be the one where we actually are making some money, big money of modular buildings or something like that, and those always fall through, but we're eternal optimists, serial optimists. But just as a profession, not just in our own offices, we have to believe and keep fighting for some entry point into another way to make money to do this. So the way we, to answer the question more directly, how do we do it? We both live on boats. In San Francisco, that's the only way we can have what we think of as kind of a magical quality of life with 360 degrees sun and view and things, which we could never do if we lived on the land. We have to live.
It's cheap.
Yeah, it's cheap. So we want to live well, but we want to do it in a cheap way. So we keep our lives fairly cheap. We do teach. So before we taught, we had to make all of our money out of what we were doing. Now sometimes we can support people a little bit in our office when we have to off of our credit cards, and so there isn't any easy way. We just have to always be hustling to do it. But there is this intention that maybe we can do a modular system. Maybe this Hawaii project is the one where they actually order 10,000, and maybe this time they don't screw us out of it through the manufacturers. But I think there is a potential. If all architects really started to work on getting involved in industry and not just being the designer on the side, but being the contractor, getting involved in these ideas of integrated project delivery, being at risk in the system, because we're at risk all the time anyway. And there's a false understanding about architects as they're terrible business people. And in reality, we are excellent business people because we're able to survive out of absolute illogical business proposition. So to work on that kind of margin, we're excellent business people. But we just have to find a way to apply that a little differently.
And I think that is a really important thing about the way we've run our practice. And Mark and I have worked together since, well, we started working together as carpenters when we were in high school, and we really had our business all the way through. And our business has always been a tool for us to do things that we wanted to do. But there are people who feel you either have to be a kind of commercial architect who abandons the more creative side of the profession, or you have to be the creative architect who does not engage in the making of the buildings that we actually live in. And we don't believe that has to be true. And I think the thing that for people getting out of school, you have the opportunity to make your own way as architects, and there are a lot more opportunities for you to use your career, your education as architects than the kind of standard models. So I would definitely, we kind of think we're unemployable by other people. Nobody would have us, but at the same time we've kind of made things work, and I believe there are opportunities for anyone who wants to kind of hang on and make opportunities for themselves. Opportunities don't drop into your lap as architects. You really have to work to get them. But we are always optimistic. The worst economy times, I always think there's some way to make a creative opportunity that also makes an income. So that was a long-winded answer.
Kind of gets to the core of the problem of architecture there.
And particularly, I think people getting out of school now, people who are in architecture school now, you have a right to be concerned about, well, what am I going to do with my education, my career? It's a difficult time in the architectural profession. But at the same time, I think it's a very optimistic and exciting time because there are skills that people are getting in school now that, particularly with the use of software and computers and the engagement in digital fabrication, I think the kind of current generation of architects are going to be set up better than any that's seen before them in terms of having that ability to take multiple paths. I mean, you might go into direct connection to digital fabrication and making things, and that's an interest in a lot of different areas of the construction industry. And I think there are probably more models for what you do with your education now than there were 10 years ago. So I would just encourage everyone to think broadly and don't feel you have to follow the narrower patterns of what you do as an architect when you get out of school, because there are any number of interesting new opportunities that you're better prepared to take on than people maybe 10 years or more older than you.
At first, I really enjoyed the talk.
At first, you really enjoyed the talk?
Sorry.
Oh, first you did, okay.
Sorry, I really enjoyed the talk. I think one thing that perhaps the talk outlines is what personality is going to happen from this practice, especially one that tries to outline a section which swerves between the practical and the playful. Okay. And it seems like it's much a question more an observation that the work that tries to blend the theories is perhaps where you're trying to push the practice. It still seems somewhat off, I guess, like for example, once the modular combines with the Abiquiu, what are your thoughts on how to compose those?
Yeah, I think that's a good observation, and probably for all architects, and some manage to get there. We haven't managed to get there yet, but there's always this ambition that you can put together all of your ideas and ambitions and your opportunities and make something that is the synthesis of both of these things, and that isn't a compromise or isn't halfway there. And that's the only potential way for that to happen is to keep trying with keeping both balls in there and trying to get there. And so as a profession too, it's, any one person or set of people may not get there, but as a profession, if we're all trying to keep these ambitions, the functional and the three balls, right? It's commodity, firmness, commodity, and delight. I mean, those are the three things that we're trying to achieve, and most often we only get one of those. Sometimes maybe two, but the goal is to bring them all together. And you have to always believe, even when it's hard to do and when you're not there yet.
And the other aspect of that is, our goal, our ambition as architects, everyone's got their goals moving forward. We would like to be able to work on larger buildings, and we would get larger commissions than we have, do more public work. Houses are, in some ways, not very interesting. They're interesting, but the thing that frustrates us about working on houses is you're putting a lot of effort into something that a small number of people, one family maybe, gets to interact with. On one hand, we would like to feel the amount of effort we put into something. It would be great to work on schools or public buildings where you're affecting the lives of more people. So in the last few years, we've gotten a chance to work on some school projects. And to me, even though that 1,000 square foot school in Hawaii, or the I guess it's 7,000 square foot building we did for Harvard Child Care Center, even though they're limited, they're not big buildings, but I'm so much more excited about something that hundreds of children are going to be in and interacting with at a really important creative time in their lives. To me, that's much more interesting than a very high budget custom home. And so where we would like our practice and our profession, our personal careers to go, is to be able to work on larger and larger buildings that do interact with the public, but we'd also like to be able to do that kind of on our terms and be able to bring along the interests that we have, the kind of combination of playfulness and practicality that we think is part of our work. And the other part is the old joke that anyone can achieve their goals, you just have to set them low enough. In a certain sense, they're trying to achieve things. Working on smaller scale projects puts you more in control. And I'm not at all embarrassed about doing small projects, because sometimes even on a very small project, you're able to control more. You can stay up all night, you can make no money on it, you can put money out of your pocket on a small project to improve it in some way. And that's been important to us. We built a doghouse once. We started our business building decks and repairing rotted wood on things. But sometimes on these very small projects, we were able to do things that I'm very proud of, and because it was a small enough project that we could put in the extra effort or something. So I would say, some people get out of school and immediately get an opportunity to work on a big project, which is great. That was never us. But I do believe that you can do smaller projects, even if it's a piece of furniture, things you might not have a client for. Maybe you get out of school and you go to work for a firm where you don't get to do much design work yourself, but you can be working on making furniture, buy some tools on your own. You can make something. There's always something that you can design and make that's within your budget of time or money, and that's one of the beauties of architecture and design. We can work with things at many different scales, and there's always a scale that you have control over.
Thank you for a delightful presentation. I've been watching you dance back and forth, wondering whether you, in your collaboration, have specialization. And both as even and shared as you present yourselves to do you kind of rely on one or the other of you to do certain things? How do you work together?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and there's two answers to it. One is our adamant stance that we design everything together, and that it's a creative combination. We don't specialize. And then there's the true answer that there still is, of course, some specialization. In the actual design process and back and forth of ideas, we do work together. And it'd be nice to say that's 90% of the time that we have in the studio, but in reality, that creative time is maybe 5%, and we're really doing a lot of other things to keep it all moving. So I tend to work more closely with engineers, contractors, and the kind of field things. Peter works more with the clients and the bankers and editors or whoever. I absolutely hate talking on the telephone myself, but I will talk to engineers and contractors, but I hate to talk to other people. So we do split things up that way.
I have patience, he does not. So if we've got a difficult client, it's like, hand it off to me. So, and I think having worked together for so long, you tend to develop things that one person does better, or we just know. Like if we need a detail for a window flashing, it's going to be Mark that's going to do that. And within our office, we have an office of about 8 people. They know which of us to talk to about different things. If we're trying to decide, something related to payments to a subcontractor and trying to decide, exactly how that's going to work, it's more likely going to be something I'm involved in. If it's a window flashing detail, Mark's going to be involved in. And if it's something that important things Mark and I always talk about together. Sometimes clients ask, well, which of you is going to be in charge of this project? We absolutely don't have his projects or my projects. It's every project in the office goes through phases. I'm more often more directly engaged with the client during the kind of programming stages and things, and Mark is more likely to be involved through the final finish stages. But every project is very much going through a process through the two of us. But just how our office works, we have younger, some very good people who are project managers. So Mark and I are the kind of principal, we are the principals, but we are the principal designers of everything, but we have younger staff. They're all right around 30 now, and each of them is a project manager for 1 or 2 or 3 projects, depending on the scale of the project. They do all the drawings, sometimes with some assistance, all the modeling of them. And we're able to be here right now because they're doing a very good job of keeping up to date on things and directly work with clients as well. So it's very much a team effort, and whenever we do a lecture, the focus is always on the people who are the founders of the firm or something, but it really is very much a team collaborative effort, and it's a very important part of doing any creative work of any size, is there's a lot of people who are part of the team.
Thank you all for staying so late and indulging.